Teach them to do. Doing is not automatic. And doing cannot be taught merely through a lecture or by passing out a few pieces of paper or writing a book. It is the work of the Holy Spirit, and it is taught by example. We have to be tutored to listen to God, tutored to follow the promptings of the Lord, tutored with a heart ready to do that which the Lord leads us towards. I was a young Bible college student in the library one day, and the Lord spoke to my heart, go to hiding place. At that time, I don't even know where hiding place is. It's where Philip Chan leads in this halfway house. I don't know Pastor Philip at that time. I know of the hiding place. I have to find the address to go. But simply because the Lord said go, immediately I went. I have no reason. I just asked for Philip Chan and say the Lord sent me. We were there, we shared, we prayed together, and out of that forged a lifelong friendship. The late Pastor Philip Chan was a dear friend of mine. I live in his home in Perth. We shared our journeys together. He's my karaoke partner. But I learned from him. I learned the compassion of this pastor. I learned the faith of this pastor. And in that friendship, I have been the beneficiary. You see, my friends, when we are willing to follow the Lord's prompting, we don't know at that season, that point in time, there is a blessing that comes through the season of life. And when we talk about whole life discipleship unto the seasons of life, there is a point in time where we just have to listen to the Lord and do what He calls us to do. I remember another occasion I was studying in the library. I was busy doing an assignment that there was much assignment during that time, and suddenly the Lord spoke to me, son, go to the prayer room to pray. In Singapore Bible College, when I was a Bible college student, there were 2 prayer rooms. There's an upper room up in the roof that is very hot. That's my noon time before lunch or during lunchtime fasting prayer. But there's the other that is in the music room. It's air conditioned, it's quiet. We can't use the place too much because the music students are there. But once in a while, it's empty and it's next to the library. So instead of climbing up to the rooftop, I went to this other room. It was empty, and I said to the Lord, Lord, here am I. Here's my Bible. Here's my open heart. Speak to me. I was ready to listen. And the Lord simply said to me, I just want to test your heart, whether you are responsive or not to my leading. That's all. I was ready to say, Lord, speak to me. I'm ready to do. And the Lord said, you have already done. You are already here. With joy, I went back to my assignments. Joy because I knew that God is leading me. It's the same kind of joy I had when the Lord said to me on another occasion, go next door to ACTI, is the mission training school. And I don't know who I'm to see. All I knew is the Lord said, get out from the library and go, and I went. And I stood at the gate and said, Lord, here am I. Where do I go? And the Lord said, look up to the building. There's an open door. On the second floor, there's an open door. I went to the open door, knocked on the door. I don't know who that person is. It was a student. I said, I'm a student in Singapore Bible College. Just came to say hi. We sat, we talked. And then I knew why the Lord sent me. He was a Korean student, and he said he was troubled in learning English in his theological studies, and with every of his assignment, he was just swamped. And he said on top of that, he has his young children to look after. And I simply said to him, the study is important, the assignments are important, but the children, they are the most important. They are your mentorees. And so that day we prayed. And then I went back to my library to study. Years passed. I was preaching in Korea. A Korean pastor came up to me, hugged me, and said, do you remember me? And I went like, I met so many people I couldn't remember. He said, we prayed together. I prayed with so many people I couldn't remember. He said, ACTI. Oh, of course, I remember the Korean young student from ACTI. He said now he's pastoring a church. It's a large church, but the excitement wasn't the church. The excitement wasn't the ministry. The excitement was his children. He says, I remember that day you told me, my children are my mentoring responsibilities. They are my ministry. And I've been blessed following that. He excitedly told me about his family, excitedly told me about his children. I have learned in the journey of life the blessing of being sensitive to the Lord's leading. I know what some of you are thinking, but God doesn't speak to me like that. He has already spoken. He has already spoken through the word of God. Whatever he says to you in the word, do it, because God knows how to direct us. He knows what to direct us into. And the way he directs us, God never misses, because he knows exactly what we need. That's the same thing I do with mentoring leaders. There are times I'll say to a leader, write a book. And in the time that we share together, and I was asked, could you mentor me? I said, well, which is true. My mentoring plate is full, but we can come and encourage one another. But you know you have the gift of writing, write a book. What I didn't tell this man, this pastor, is write a book. And if you're willing to do that, I will mentor you. And the book was written. There are at least 3 pastors I know who have written their books as a result. Now, please understand, writing a book is not the criteria for being mentored. The point is they were willing to do. After all, that's what mentoring is about. As a leadership mentor, I can see, I don't ask every of my mentorees to write a book, because there are mentors and there are tormentors. I am not a tormentor. There are some who just cannot write. But there are others who could. There's something in them. And I want to draw that out. I know what I'm doing as a leadership mentor. Now, please understand, God knows even infinitely more what he is doing when he directs us. For another mentoree, I might say, come to join me in my New York class. And I didn't tell the person, when you come, if you come, we will enter a mentoring journey together. A number of the mentoring journeys come out of that. My point is, as a human being, I know how to lead and how to mentor, meaning what is good for my mentorees, how to develop them, how much more God. So when he tells us to do something, pay attention, because God knows what he's asking us to do. He knows why it is important. He knows how it will develop us. So do yourself a favor. Whatever he says to you, whatever God says to you, just do it, because he knows what he's directing you in. But here's the other side of the coin. On the other extreme, we can be overcommitted activists who are busy just doing. Some say rest. I have no time to rest. We can rest when we get to heaven. Now, there is a difference between knowing the importance of doing and knowing what's important to do. When I talk about the importance of doing is cradled by the idea of knowing what's important to do. Often, many in the doing camp know the importance of doing, but fail to grasp what's important to do. We should not be doing for doing's sake. In essence, it is doing what Christ has commanded us, which is doing the will of the Father. God has already revealed his will to the scriptures. Learn the scriptures, be rooted in the scriptures, for in the scriptures we find the will of the Father. There was once when a leader called to share a complex problem with me and asked what he can do about it. As a leadership mentor, I've received quite a number of these calls for perspective and for help. And the main thing I said to these leaders is this: focus on God's leading. Don't ask the question, what can I do? It's the wrong question. Ask the question, what must I do? Because you can do 101 things. But what must you do? What is God's call for you? What is God's direction for you? Slow down, pause in the presence of God. Seek Him until you are clear, until there's clarity in what God calls you to do, until you know what you must do. You see, throughout the scriptures, the will of God is paramount. It is the only thing that truly matters. Jesus came to fulfill the will of God. For the will of God is the essential litmus test to everything that is ultimately worthwhile and everything that is divinely approved. For Jesus, doing the will of God was paramount. Mark chapter 3 verse 35, for whoever does the will of God is my brother and my sister and my mother. That's how important doing God's will is. John chapter 4 verse 34, my food is to do the will of Him who sent me and to accomplish His work. Likewise for the Apostle Paul, the will of God was paramount. Romans 12:2, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, and by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. The will of God to the Apostle Paul is pertinent to Christian dedication. Ephesians chapter 5 verse 17, therefore do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is. Foolishness is defined by the Apostle Paul as missing the will of God. Colossians 1:9, and so from the day we heard, we have not ceased to pray for you, asking that you may be filled with the knowledge of His will in all spiritual wisdom and understanding. The will of God is the key to walking worthy of our calling. But wait a second. Why must the will of God be paramount? Why doesn't God take into account our will and our feelings? First things first, God is God and we are not. Resenting this truth does not change His existential reality. Just as much as resenting the sun for our sunburn would not cause it to cease rising in the morning. In Isaiah chapter 55 verse 9, God Himself declares, as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. Now even so, why must the will of God be paramount? Let's think this through theologically. Let's view this through the lenses of another question. Why must God be glorified? I've shared this often, but I want to remind us because it's so important in Christian discipleship. Why must God be glorified? Put simply, if we glorify ourselves, it's pride. But when God glorifies Himself, that is not pride. It is not just okay, it is absolutely essential. Here's why. Because God is the absolute and perfect moral good of the entire universe. So what? Well, to champion good in the moral universe, God is judicially obliged to glorify all that is good and reserve the highest glory for the highest good. But since there's no higher good than God Himself, God is obligated by ontological necessity and moral authority to both glorify Himself and to make His sovereign will singularly paramount, because God is the highest good in the entire universe. To say that God's will is absolutely perfect is simply to affirm the essential nature of God. God is perfectly perfect, and you cannot improve on perfection. So since God is perfectly perfect, and His will is gloriously glorious, redemptively redemptive, and sovereignly sovereign, then whole life discipleship must be a discipleship unto God's will for us and unto every God-directed calling for our lives. In practical outworking, to do God's will and to answer God's call for our life, we must live an intentional life. Are you living an incidental life, or are you living an intentional life? Recently, I talk about the marks of an intentional life. And in my think time, I wrote down 10 differences between the intentional life and the incidental life. Let me share these 10 with you. The first, the intentional life is conscious about the brevity of life and it doesn't take time for granted. But the incidental life misguidedly assumes there's lots of time and thereby take life and time for granted. 2, the intentional life is conscious about life as a gift of God and seeks to steward it for the glory of God. But the incidental life takes life for granted and self-centeredly lives unto itself. 3, the intentional life invests time to live for what really matters. It answers the why question, what really matters. But the incidental life squanders time instead of investing it and lives for one's indulgences. It merely answers the what question. 4, the intentional life lives by well-defined priorities and is meaningfully busy. But the incidental life has no defined priorities and is mindlessly busy. Are you meaningfully busy or mindlessly busy? 5, the intentional life is directed by the compass and is led to the important. The incidental life is driven by the clock and is led by the urgent. Are you living for the important or merely directed by the urgent? The 6th difference, the intentional life is a disciplined and directed life, but the incidental life is driven by self-indulgent impulses. There's a lack of discipline. Number 7, the intentional life is guided by clear core values, but the incidental life has undefined or unclear values. Values is living for what really matters, a clarity of values. The incidental life doesn't have that. The 8th difference, the intentional life embraces deep convictions and pursues excellence, but the incidental life embraces convenience and pursues ease. Number 9, the intentional life pauses to evaluate life and to improve the art of living. But the incidental life has no time to pause, evaluate, or improve. And number 10, the difference between the intentional life and the incidental life. The intentional life embraces community and adopts wise accountability. But the incidental life pays lip service to community and has little inclination for true accountability. Oh, let's learn to live life intentionally. To intentionally live the intentional life is important in whole life discipleship that lives unto the calling of God. But wait, what exactly is the calling of God? What exactly does God require of us? There's a verse in the Old Testament, Micah 6:8. To me, it is one of the most important discipleship verses in the whole of the Bible. Micah 6:8 says, He has told you, O man, what is good and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. Business leaders want to get to the bottom line fast. The best leaders learn to eyeball what really matters, the bottom line. Micah 6:8 cuts to the chase. It gets to the bottom line of what really matters. In this light, Micah 6:8 represents prophetic leadership at its finest. Here's the bottom line. He has told you, O man, what is good and what does the Lord require of you. Everything is reduced to the irreducible minimum here. 3 strands of true faith, 3 strands of true discipleship. 1, to do justice. 2, to love kindness. And 3, to walk humbly with our God. Micah hailed from a small village called Moresheth. It's about 20 miles southwest of Jerusalem. Moresheth was one of the 46 towns destroyed by the Assyrian Empire under the reign of King Sennacherib. They were forced to flee to Jerusalem for safety. Ah, Jerusalem, the city of David, the beloved city of God. Surely they will be protected here in Jerusalem. But Micah gave a blistering prophecy against Jerusalem, the city they sought refuge in. In Micah 3:12, Micah said, Jerusalem will become a heap of ruins. Here's a country bumpkin of a prophet renouncing a great city. And to add insult to injury, Micah prophesied that the Messiah would not be born in Jerusalem, but in Bethlehem, another small country pumpkin hometown. You can see how unpopular Prophet Micah was. But Micah was grappling with the central question of religion. Consider the theological issue that Micah raised. The issue is this. Here's the question. How can God be rightly approached by men? Verse 6. Wherewith shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before the high God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves of a year old? That's a rhetorical question. You see, in Jewish theology, man cannot approach the holy God without an atoning sacrifice. So to the rhetorical question, shall I come before God with a sacrifice? The answer is duh, but of course, obvious. You cannot come before God without a sacrifice. Now, a searching question then follows this rhetorical question. If an atoning sacrifice is required, will God be impressively pleased with a massive sacrifice? Verse 7. Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams or with 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? Is that what pleases God? Think about it. Thousands of rams. Wow. 10,000s of rivers of oil. Wow. Impressive. Now add to this the ultimate sacrifice of a firstborn, esteemed in pagan culture as the over-the-top religious zeal. Wow, 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 the sacrifice of your firstborn. These massive sacrifices will certainly impress the socks out of any pagan deity. But not Jehovah. Not Jehovah. Why? Because that's not the bottom line. Micah 6:8 gives the bottom line. He has shown you, oh man. He doesn't leave us guessing. He has shown you what is good. In other words, what is essential for life and for living. He has shown you. This is what he requires of you. The Hebrew word for require is dara. And dara is a complex and fascinating word. The basic idea is not God has demanded of you, but rather God's desire for you. You see, when lovers dara each other, their desire for each other, out of their devotion to each other, comes across. When Ezra studied the law, he daras the law of God. He delights in the law of God. He desires the law of God. So here is what God truly desires of us. To do justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with our God. You cannot get more basic than this. Let's explore it briefly. Number 1, to do justly. The Hebrew is mishpat. This is to live so as to do that which is right with our fellow men. The primary essence of justice is righteousness. So mishpat is not just merely a good idea or a nice suggestion. For Samuel 8:3, Samuel's son did not walk in his ways, but turned aside after gain. They took bribes and prevented mishpat. prevented justice or righteousness. Now, Mishpat had two inherent ideas in relation to gain and in relation to sharing. Mishpat, in relation to gain, is what is lawful gain and what is not. In other words, in our life, whatever profit, whatever gain, whatever income, we must determine what is lawful gain and what is not. That mishpat, lawful, righteous, just. And in relation to sharing, there is a special tender inclination of mishpat towards the poor and the disadvantaged. The second, to love mercy. The Hebrew word is a common word, hesed, translated loving kindness. Hesed is the grace word of the Old Testament. This is to love so as to do that which is good to our fellow men. You see, consumerism compromises mishpat and hesed, justice and mercy. For consumerism, the bane of contemporary culture, has propagated a persuasive narrative championing a self-centered notion of personal rights and personal choices. Thus, my rights and my choice color our perspective and control our decisions. As a result, Western democracies and capitalism have unwittingly elevated the social entitlements of systemic greed and obliterated from our social consciousness the rights of the disadvantaged. In practical outworking, follow these three basic rules. If it's not yours, don't take it. If it's not true, don't say it. If it's not right, don't do it. If it's not yours, don't take it. If it's not true, don't say it. If it's not right, don't do it. The third, to walk humbly with your God. The Hebrew, sanua. This is to do that which is needful, so that we can live aright and love aright as God requires. And the primal essence of that needful walk is humility. In short, we cannot approach God without righteousness in mishpat, to do justly, loving kindness in hesed, to love mercy, and brokenness in sanua, to walk humbly. And get this, all three of these are found at the cross of Jesus. Justice is found at the cross of Jesus. Mercy is found at the cross of Jesus. Humility and brokenness is found at the cross of Jesus. Jesus grants us what God does for us. God desires justice. Jesus grants justice by his atoning sacrifice. God desires kindness and mercy. Jesus grants kindness and mercy as our Messiah. God desires humility. Jesus exemplifies humility and brokenness as a servant king. So, what does God really require of us? Don't miss this point. This is holy ground. Get this. What does God really require of us? God requires of us to stand under the shadow of the cross. Because at the cross, it fulfills everything that God requires. That Jesus at the cross gives to us that newness of life to fulfill all that God requires, because he fulfills it on our behalf. Under both his redemptive power and his discipleship call, the cross of Jesus Christ moves us to a lifelong discipleship that fulfills God's longing for us. Are you ready to stand under the cross of Jesus? Let me end with a moving story a fellow pastor shared with our church a while ago. On March 26, 2017, a group of Coptic Christians were making their way in 2 buses to a retreat center in Egypt. They were stopped by terrorists who opened fire on one of the buses, killing many of the Christians there. Some terrorists boarded the second bus and got those who were not Christians off the bus. By the way, how did they know who were the Christians? Upon baptism, Coptic Christians receive a tattoo of the cross on their wrists. Here's a story as told by one of the survivors. The terrorists went onto the second bus and were shooting each passenger one by one. They came to a young boy with his mother. The terrorists looked at the boy and said, "You are still young. Renounce Jesus and you can get off this bus." The boy huddled up to his mother, who put her arms round her young son. Pause for a moment. What would you do as a mother? What would a Singaporean mother say to her son in such a situation? This is what was reported to us. The mother told her young son, "You must never deny Jesus. You must never renounce your Lord." The terrorists promptly shot the boy and the mother after that. That's a price believers pay in Egypt today. And in the persecuted countries, that's the discipleship price many believers pay today. That's the whole of life offered unto Jesus. Why? Because they understood the power of the cross, the meaning of the cross. Because the starting point of true discipleship is not in the classroom, not in a conference. The starting point is at the cross of Jesus. If any man come after me, let him deny